hello, everybody. This is Mish Men. I am Adam Mauser, and
I'm Dustin Labar.
that's right. And this is another episode of Mish Men. And what number is this, Dusty? You recall?
This is going to be number 5.
Number 5.
Number 5. If you listened last week, it was about the great and powerful USFL.
That's right.
So hopefully you guys enjoyed that one.
Hope so. And speaking of which, we're enjoying the feedback. Now, we have personal friends that we've shared the podcast with, and we're getting excellent feedback. Yep. We appreciate all the listeners out there and subscribers and the likers, if you will, that get on there. Share this with your friends, especially if you enjoy it. Even if you don't enjoy it, share it with your friends.
Yeah, even if you hate the podcast but like us.
That's right.
Like just like it. Just subscribe, share it. But I know you're going to like it.
Repeatedly.
Yes, multiple times.
But we do appreciate that. The word's getting out. We're getting we have a growing number of subscribers, which is very encouraging. Because when you start something like this, you wonder, like, is anybody going to listen to broken window fallacy, USFL, that kind of hodgepodge or mishmash of subjects?
It is a mishmash.
It is a mishmash.
Yeah, we do appreciate that. I've really gotten, I know separately, but I've gotten text messages from people that say, hey, I really enjoyed that episode and I learned a lot, or I really like the way you guys interact with each other or whatever. And we're going to keep it rolling, and we're just going to keep getting better. But yeah, we appreciate everybody's support so far.
Yeah, very good. So thank you again, and we'll just get started.
Let's do it.
So the topic is loosely logic. But there are some axioms, and that might come into play a little bit later on when we're talking. So if you recall last time when we did the episode on Bastiat's Law, I was talking about there's some axioms, there's some presuppositions or things that you accept before you can move out and branch out into other areas. That's not circular reasoning, where some folks will say, well, you're being circular because you think this. Everyone has presuppositions. Everyone does. Before we get down that path, though, I'd like to, have you ever heard of the parable of the blind men and an elephant?
The parable of the blind man and the elephant. I sure haven't.
So this is, it's a way to describe relative truth.
Okay.
So many postmodernists will attribute, well, you can't know truth because they have this, and they lay out this parable. And the parable goes like this. There's an elephant, and there are 5 or 6, depending on the telling of it, blind men, and one's got the trunk, and he says, oh, that feels like a snake. And the other one's like feeling on the leg, oh, it's a tree trunk. And the other one's got the tail, that feels like a rope. And one's got the ear, and he's like, oh, that's a fan. So their perception, they think that these different things. And so the parable goes that, well, you can't know because you're just sensing all these things. But the elephant in the room, if you will, to really butcher this, is there is an elephant.
Yeah.
There is truth, and that truth transcends what they sense.
Okay.
So a presupposition of mine and many, I don't subscribe to the postmodernist notion that there is no truth, because if you say there is no truth, well, is that true?
Okay.
Or is that false? And so it always goes back to a binary proposition, always, always, always. And so, at any rate, axiomatically, or my presupposition is that truth exists, and it's immutable. It doesn't change. It doesn't change with time. It doesn't change with condition. It doesn't change with perception. There is truth, and it's to be, it coheres with what we see.
Can I ask a dumb question, maybe?
Absolutely.
So
there are no dumb questions.
There are some people that believe there is no truth. Is that what you're saying?
That there is no absolute.
There's no absolute
immutable truth. That's the postmodernist worldview in a nutshell.
And that's like including everything, like like there's no truth just in general. There's
correct.
Okay, interesting.
Yes.
Okay.
That it's fluid.
Okay. That
it changes over time or over through perceptions and that sort of thing.
Oh, I understand. Okay.
So
that makes more sense.
Yeah.
Got it.
So the blind man and the elephant. So there is immutable truth, and so here we go with the 3 fundamental laws of logic. And if you remember, I'm recalling back to that quiz I wrote for Spinner v. Weiss.
Yep.
And that was one of the questions. What are the 3 laws of logic? And I think I turned it into a multiple choice.
Okay.
And I don't know if you recall any of those, but I'll run down them real quick.
Yeah.
The 3 laws were identity, non-contradiction, and excluded middle.
Okay.
So identity, that means whatever is. And it sounds really simple and basic.
Sure.
But if you reject these notions, it's because you don't subscribe to the notion of an immutable absolute truth.
Okay.
So all A is A.
Okay.
That's the way you would write out mathematically. And these laws of logic can apply through different venues, and we'll talk about that in a bit.
Okay.
So that's a law of identity. All A is A. So all dogs are dogs.
Okay. I was going to say all cups are cups, or that cup is a cup.
Absolutely.
Basically. Gotcha.
The law of non-contradiction is nothing can both be A and not A. So nothing can be both B and not B.
Got you. So that
Not
can't
the
be
letters.
that can't be a cup and also not a cup.
Correct.
Yeah. It's either it is a cup or it's not a cup.
That's right.
Yeah. Gotcha.
It goes back down to that binary that
Gotcha.
I was just talking about.
Binary.
Yeah.
How dare you?
Yeah, I know. And then the last one's the law of the excluded middle, that everything must be either B or not B,
Okay.
not the letters B. So go ahead.
No, go ahead. Finish what you were going to say.
So you can't have this middle ground where you're
Okay.
both a dog and a cat,
Gotcha.
or you're both a male and a female.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
Or you're both a cup and a jar.
Okay. So, yeah, I got you.
Yeah.
So if you're a cup, you're a cup. If you're a jar, you're a jar. You can't be both of those things.
You can't be both at the same time.
Yeah, at the same time.
That is correct.
Yes. They seem very basic and simple, Adam.
It is very basic and simple, but not everyone subscribes to these laws of logic.
I don't think I ever put much thought to the fact that somebody would argue those things that you just talked about. Do you know what I mean?
It doesn't seem like one would,
Yeah.
but with different worldviews, then you have to reject those.
Okay.
And so why do we have to have those? Why do we need those? And where do they come from? Well, it comes from years and years of just deep thinking. There's a lot of subscription to Aristotle as being the author of non-contradiction,
Mm-hmm.
where he popularized it.
Okay.
But none of these ideas are new.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he didn't come up with it. Everything traces back to its origin. And if you believe that there is a transcendent truth, well, where did that come from?
Okay.
Well, it has to be outside of everything that we can sense or discover or realize. It has to be outside of that,
Mm-hmm.
by definition, if it transcends us.
Right. Okay.
So where does that stuff work? I mean, where can you see it? Well, science, math,
Mm-hmm.
because you can count on these things all the time. If you're trying to solve a math problem, you rely on you're not reading those laws of logic and say, oh, well, the answer has to be 3 because of the law of non-contradiction.
Right.
It's more of a matter of you assume those are axiomatic,
Right.
they're presuppositions, that those things are true.
Right.
And then so math is now repeatable.
So, for example, we know that 2 is this many, and 2 is this many.
And you're holding 2 fingers.
Yeah. So
on
I'm
each
holding 2. If you're just listening, 2 fingers on my left hand, 2 fingers on my right hand. If I add those together, because I know this one's 2 and this one's 2, they're going to equal 4.
They're
if I
gonna
add them
equal
together.
4.
Yeah.
hand. Not sometimes,
That is
and not just the 1800s.
That is what it is. Did you see that thing where that girl claimed that math was sexist and racist?
I didn't, but
Because
I'm
2
not
plus 2.
surprised. Yeah.
But that really drove home when you said about people not believing in that. And the first thing that popped in my head was math, because you'd be like, well, nobody would argue math. And then that popped into my head where you're like, oh no, that person did actually argue that 2 plus 2 didn't have to equal 4. She basically what it boiled down to is she was like, if 2 felt like 3, then it would be not 4.
Right.
And you're like, well, but then it would be 3 and not 2 any longer,
Right.
which is kind of like that.
The law of identity.
Yeah. If A is 2, it is 2. That's just what it is.
Right.
I got it.
And it comes from this postmodern worldview that Nietzsche, the philosopher from the 1800s, German philosopher,
Yep.
He predicted a lot of this stuff. Like, he subscribed to a lot of it, but he also predicted a lot of it. I'm not prepared to go down that, but that's a lot of stuff that he predicted.
Mm-hmm.
Because once you start demolishing these things, then you completely. In fact, he's got that famous statement about, where is God? God is dead. We killed him.
Okay.
Because of this worldview, this postmodern worldview, then you have to demolish the idea of God, because there can be no transcendent truth.
Makes sense.
So anyway, so science, math, computer computer science is really just logic, applied logic.
Mm-hmm.
That's really all it is. And critical thinking. So critical thinking, it seems to be in short supply these days, I would argue.
Yeah, do they still teach that in school?
I don't think so.
Because that used to be part of like tests, critical thinking.
I don't think so. I think it's one of those things that the critical thinking, like what is that? That's linking your thinking to reason, to understanding transcendent truth, to understanding laws of logic, laws of thought, that if this, then that, and then it would just, therefore X.
Right.
And so once you demolish that, once you remove that kind of thinking from the schools, like teaching logic,
right.
well, then people are now, they're subject to their own emotions.
Right.
And making decisions based off emotions. So emotional thinking is, I think, prevalent these days.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
For sure. Critical thinking is like major problem solving, which has like real world applications to it.
It does.
So if they're not teaching that any longer, that's a major problem.
It is a major problem. So, we've strove to teach our own kids, Jennifer and I, my wife Jennifer, for the listeners that don't know me, to teach them these things as best we can. And just so that they're prepared for thinking that runs counter to that, and they can deal with it. They can understand it. They can understand where these are coming from. So, so on that note, let's talk about some logical fallacies, and we might dig into these a little bit.
Okay.
And just a little bit more back and forth on it, if you will.
Yeah.
And these are informal fallacies. So before I get down to those, there are formal fallacies that come from the type of propositional logic. Have you seen things like statements? There's 3 statements, like all dogs are mammals.
I understand what you're saying.
And and there's like a little symbol for therefore. So all this, this statement, that statement, therefore this statement, which is the unknown. And so that's called a syllogism.
Okay.
And those get very complicated very quick. And if you want to challenge yourself, and the listeners, if you want to challenge yourself on these, look up syllogisms and look up the fallacious arguments, because the argument might be valid.
Okay.
But it could be a fallacious argument because it doesn't flow correctly the way it ought.
So it would be something like if you were saying all dogs are mammals, all mammals eat X, therefore dogs eat this.
Correct.
That's what you're saying. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. So you're linking all of them together.
Yeah.
You're drawing some conclusions based on the information you're given, basically.
Right.
I gotcha.
And it's a series of if-then statements. If this, then this,
okay.
Therefore that.
Gotcha. Understood.
And that's the flow. But those are, if you want to really challenge yourself, unless you've already been brought up on it, but if you've never heard of these syllogisms before, look it up, because you will conform your thinking through through learning that process in a way that you probably haven't been exposed to before. And it's hard.
Yeah.
It is very hard.
Yeah.
Some of them are really simple, but then they start getting into the fallacious arguments where you see that some of those things might be valid statements to make, but you cannot reasonably conclude. You can't agree with the therefore statement because it's a fallacious.
Okay, I understand what
argument.
you're saying. I understand what you're saying. Okay.
So it's pretty interesting.
Okay.
So, but there's a lot of informal fallacies.
Okay.
And there's some common ones that folks kind of gravitate towards just in your discussions with folks. Have you heard of any of these, like a fallacious argument or anything like that?
If you explain one, maybe I have.
Okay, so let's do ad hominem, which means to the man.
Okay.
So we're having this discussion, and I say, IPA beer is garbage.
Okay.
It's just, it was created by the British because they had to really hop up the beer, literally put a bunch of hops in the beer, so it would last the whole voyage when they sent it to India.
Okay.
And it's just trash beer.
Okay.
And I know I might be losing some listeners, but it is a fact that it is
Gotcha.
trash beer. So anyway, they loaded up the beer with a bunch of hops so it would last all the way to the trip to India, and it's now become this niche market with IPAs, India Pale Ale. So anyway, I say that, and then your ad hominem is like, you don't know what you're talking about. You like this kind of beer.
Yeah, okay.
And so you attack me rather than the argument that I've laid out.
Got you.
So ad hominem is to the man. Instead of to the argument, it's to the man.
So you say something and then I insult or attack you as a person versus being like, here's a fact about what you just said that it's incorrect. Instead of being like, that's not true about your statement, I'm like, you drink Michelob Ultra, so what would you even know?
Right.
Yeah. Gotcha.
Yeah. So it's just it's an attack to the man
Gotcha.
instead of the argument. And a lot of these are diversions from what the argument is
Sure.
to something else.
Women all the time, am I right?
I'm not going to go into that. I will not. Nope.
Just kidding.
Yeah. He was just kidding, everybody.
Just kidding.
Ladies and gentlemen.
Especially if my wife listens.
I hope she's listening. Or at least liking and subscribing.
She definitely likes and subscribes.
Okay.
And she likes our logo, and she likes your voice.
Okay,
She
there you
said
go.
nothing about me personally.
So I'd mentioned another. So that's a type of logical fallacy.
Okay.
Can you think of any others? Not a quiz, just some, you know.
So you're saying ad hominem is one.
Mm-hmm.
So that's attacking the man versus the
argument.
And
my argument is, in that example, IPA is trash.
Right. I'm not sure. Give me another one.
So post hoc ergo propter hoc.
Okay, I don't know that.
So I talked about that.
I've heard you say it before.
Yes.
I've heard you say it before.
It's one of my favorites.
Okay.
So I'll give the example.
Okay.
And then you'll understand it from there.
Okay.
So every time I bring my umbrella to my Suburban, it rains.
Yeah.
So does my umbrella cause it to rain? Of course not.
I remember you talking about this now. That's right.
So just because something happens before it precedes something else. So post means after, hoc, this.
Yep.
Because, ergo, propter, therefore, hoc, that.
Got you.
So literally it's after this, therefore, because that.
Yep.
So just because I wear a coat out in the wintertime,
Yep.
that doesn't mean make it cold.
Right, I got you.
And just because, let's say there's a cold that gets spread really quick,
Mm-hmm.
and then they make a condition. Let's say they make everybody wear earmuffs
Right.
to prevent the cold.
Okay.
That's some sort of PPE that's earmuffs.
Sure.
And then the cases go down. That doesn't mean that wearing earmuffs reduce the exposure to colds.
Yeah, the spread. Gotcha.
Or maybe masks.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I see what you did there.
Yeah. That was very carefully threaded. There's one that's related, and that's cum hoc, ergo propter hoc. So that's, in short, it's correlation doesn't imply causation.
Okay.
And in fact, if you go to the web, I didn't do this for this exercise, but there's a website that has data that implies, just because it correlates,
Mm-hmm.
it implies crazy things. If you were to subscribe to this fallacy, if you think this fallacy is true, that, well, washing machines, the purchase of washing machines, and Nicolas Cage movies, they seem to be on the same cycle.
Okay.
And so, therefore, that, whenever washing machines go up, the purchase of them, then we're going to see a Nicolas Cage movie.
Okay, I got you.
Which is near constant. So
Yeah.
I don't see how that could be true. But I was just come up with an example. There are many examples like that, and we talked about that during the Bastiat's episode with World War II. Just because.
Oh yes, gotcha. I remember that. But
Yeah.
but go ahead and continue on in case they missed that episode. You use the example of
that some folks would subscribe to the notion that World War II ended
mm-hmm.
the Great Depression. And it's not necessarily true. There are some things that are factors that affected that, but it did not cause it because of that broken window fallacy,
Right.
which was it's a destructive act.
Gotcha.
So that doesn't really lift an economy so much net.
Right.
So those are two and a half, three logical fallacies. How about some others?
I don't. All the names are very fancy.
They're fancy.
Yeah.
So here's how you can know if something is difficult to understand intentionally.
Okay.
So the medical profession, they love using Latin.
For sure.
Logic, they love using Latin.
Yes.
Law, they love using Latin. So those are three big areas that, hey, let's just use the Latin terms, and it just messes with people's head.
Yeah.
So there's I've got a term for that somewhere in my spreadsheet of words. I'll have to share that sometime.
Yeah,
Maybe we'll do an episode on that sometime.
I would love to. That'd be so much fun.
My sesquipedalia.
We used that on one episode. You were listening.
Yeah, we did.
On Reaching for the Bars.
So another one is to Coke, to use more. So that means you also. So that's the faulty appeal to hypocrisy. And so if I say, in fact, this is a good one for your kids.
Okay.
Your kid might do a to Coke on you. If you say, hey, Junior, I saw that you were speeding the other day in your car, and because you got a ticket.
Right.
And we got it in the mail. And then Junior turns back to you and says, well, you speed all the time, Dad.
Yep.
Well, that's not really the argument.
Yeah.
You got a ticket for speeding. I didn't. And so the argument is you shouldn't speed.
Yep.
And so to Coke is one of those that you also, or so's your old man. That's another.
And then the argument to that as a parent is do as I say, not as I do.
Yeah. So it's funny you mentioned that. So at the time, our oldest, Andrew, I was teaching him formal logic. So we were going through this whole curriculum of formal logic, and including the syllogisms. Again, they were tough, really tough for me to understand and then explain with him. So it was a lot of fun. It was very challenging. And so anyway, we were having this discussion at the table, and he was getting in trouble from his mom about something, whatever it was. And then he points out her fallacious argument to him. And I was like, all right, time out. You're misunderstanding the point.
Yeah.
So you
really
should
funny.
be pointing out, this thing, because it might be true, but she's still your mom. Yeah. So
he's like, Mom, what a fallacious argument. You're like, oh boy.
Well, he went further. He was very explicit. He was correct. That argument was, this, and like, well, that's kind of,
that's pretty funny.
And it was almost the to Coke one, which is the appeal to hypocrisy.
Gotcha. That's funny.
So, appeal to authority. What do you think of that one?
Appeal to authority. So I guess if you made an argument, I would go around you to somebody that's in charge of you versus arguing versus trying to refute your argument.
It could be that.
Okay.
It could be that. Or it could be, let's say I'm a medical doctor.
Okay.
And I say, hey, you need to do this. You need to subscribe to this thing that I want you to do.
Okay.
And you say, well, why do I need to do that? And like, well, trust me, because I'm a doctor. You wouldn't understand.
Understood.
And when you start reading about appeal to authority, the literature these days explains it to where, well, but sometimes it's necessary that appeal to authority. But when you're talking about argumentation and debate, I'm sorry, that's out.
Well, that's probably the one that's literally happened the most over the past 3 years.
Absolutely.
That's probably the one that all the ones you just said, that is probably the one that has literally happened the most at any time. And I can name so many instances where they're just like, I'm a doctor. And you're like, okay.
Right.
So, and you'd be like, well, you're a biologist. I'm not listening to you.
Right.
So, but that's happened, and we're not trying to hide anything. Like, during the COVID situation, it was very stressful for people because there was people that have like a thirst for knowledge or wanted to see like things like studies. It was like, I'm a doctor.
Yeah, trust me.
Just trust me. It's like, oh, well, I'd like to see some data. You don't need data. I'm telling you, and I'm, and that's, that's probably, that one rings the most true out of all the ones we just talked about, because that's literally,
100%.
And people like me immediately are pushing back against that. They're like, I don't care if you're a doctor or not.
Right, because if you can't explain it in simple terms, then you're not that much of an expert
That's
as you're
100%
appealing
correct.
to be.
I think, that one and what has happened recently is like, if you can boil things down to the layman can understand, and then you can get them on board that way, especially when you have people like me that exist out there that are super bullheaded. The answer of just trust me because I said so is not going to...
It doesn't work.
It's not going to work. And
it shouldn't work for just bullheaded people. It should work for, many more people than it does, I would argue.
Yeah. Oh, I agree. But that specific time was a stressful time. So some people were just like, I'm getting on board, and, some people are, this doctor said, but it's so funny because in that same breath, I have a relative of mine, just in case that person listens. I have a relative of mine. We don't see eye to eye on anything. And I would send her an article from a doctor, or she would send me an article, and she'd be like, this is from a doctor. You have to believe it. And then I would send her an article from another doctor that refuted that. And she'd be like, well, that guy's a quack.
Right.
Okay. Well, what makes your doctor more of a doctor than my doctor?
Okay. Let me just pause there for a second.
Okay.
Because that's another logical fallacy, kind of, sort of.
Okay.
It's called the no true Scotsman fallacy. Okay. And again, some of these are informal and they have these odd names. So the example goes like this. My dad puts honey on his porridge.
Okay.
And the other guy says, well, no Scotsman likes honey on his porridge. And so your dad is not a true Scotsman.
Gotcha.
So there's this qualifier that, well, no true Scotsman or no doctor worth his salt
would think this way.
Yeah. And so, so in that realm, there's this desire to complicate things and muddy waters. And that's how you know if something is, in my mind anyway, I automatically get suspect when someone starts saying, well, you don't understand, and because there's this and there's that, and they start and there's another fallacy in there. It doesn't come to mind immediately. But when you just start, instead of arguing, and when I say arguing, I don't mean like yelling and screaming and finger pointing. I mean a two different propositions that are being discussed back and forth.
Uh-huh.
That if the other person starts just throwing out this other thing, other chaff or flair to confuse the issue, I automatically become suspect. That
sure,
you're not talking about what we're talking about. You're just trying to chum the waters with more confusion.
I gotcha.
So Isaac Newton had this quote. I wrote it down here. Truth is ever to be found in the simplicity and not in the multiplicity and confusion of things.
Yeah.
Isaac Newton, kind of a smart guy, invented calculus. There's some folks that say he didn't and that some other guy did. Yeah. That's neither here nor there. So a reasoned thinker, without a doubt. Mm-hmm. And even he says, as complicated as his thinking produced a lot of very complicated tools, it's the simplicity of things.
Yeah.
And, the mark of a true genius is somebody can take this complicated subject and reduce it down to distill it to this 2 or 3 moving parts that's easy to understand.
Yeah.
And so back to your example of the past couple of years, if the medical authority, and I'm going to use that term because that's what they deem themselves,
sure.
and that's what culturally, I'd say culturally we subscribe to. Not every individual, and I rejected that notion.
Right.
And you rejected that notion, but not everybody did. And that's no judgment there, but that's what happened. They would conflate and start adding more mystery to it with, well, you don't understand, I have this data and I have these data. And this is a notion that someone would say, a lot of folks say, well, facts speak for themselves or the data speaks for itself. Data are accurate, on and on it goes. Data are always interpreted
right
from a reasoned perspective. Mm-hmm. And if it can't be explained, no matter how complicated it seems, if it can't be explained in very simple terms, then it might be invalid. Not saying it is. It might be invalid.
Do you recall what was one of the most regurgitated thing that people said during that time was, which I'll just tell you so you don't have to guess, was trust the science.
Yeah, trust the science.
Which is a really funny notion because science is an act of research.
It's a process,
It's a process. It's not, science isn't a thing to trust. Science is just the research. So somebody saying just trust the science, you're like, when people are like, well, where's the data? Because that's also science. I'm putting things together and they're like, just trust the science.
Right.
You're like, well, I'm asking, where's that? And they're like, just trust the science. Yeah. You're like, where is it? Yeah. You just saying trust the science is not necessarily trusting the science or that it's correct. Science is a process.
It is a process.
So, which is really funny. And I was going to mention something as you were talking. Do you think that part of these things, this logical thing or these logical arguments or fallacies are because emotions get involved? You can see the people when they argue or have a dispute with somebody that's very logical, it always draws this huge emotional response.
Yeah,
when that one person can stay logical and not be emotional, that other person always gets way more upset and then does all these things that you're talking about.
Yes.
Because they can't, and part of it's not being right or correct. They're wrong. Or they can't argue with this person because that person is not putting emotion into it and it's just pure logic. Like this is this. And there's no emotion to it, and that person that's why you see these people red-faced, screaming at people, and you're like, well, obviously this guy has got a rise out of you by just sitting there and telling you facts, basically.
Right.
So I'm just wondering, as time goes on and people, are using this more as like they can't be logical. They are emotional. Because I think those two have a major effect on each other. It's harder to be logical and when you have a lot of emotion in it.
I think you default to that, just like someone that doesn't. Let's think in the physical facet of our lives. If you don't train your body physically and you don't do hard things physically, so let's say lift weights, do exercise, calisthenics, whatever it is. If you don't do that, if you don't train your body physically,
right,
you get weak and it atrophies.
Mm-hmm.
And the muscle tissue gets soft and other things start to atrophy as a result.
Right.
So it decays, your body decays.
Sure.
If you do not train your mind
100%.
in critical thinking skills, the way you do that is through rigid thinking, learning logical thinking, reasoning,
right,
understanding a coherent argument, understanding that truth, that a series of facts conforming to truth,
right,
it's a well-reasoned argument,
Mm-hmm.
therefore X.
right,
And if you don't subscribe to that, then you get to a point, all you have is the emotional response.
right,
And Thomas Sowell, he's one of my favorite thinkers. He's an economist by training, but he's a very clear thinker, and he can explain a whole host of subjects in very clear terms. And he has a great quote about schools these days teaching people what to think and how they should feel
right.
by how to think.
Understood.
And because not everyone, many people will argue from emotion,
Right.
and then once they conflict or once they collide
Mm-hmm.
with a rigid thinker, someone, and when I say rigid thinker, I mean a clear, critical thinker that
Right.
that forms an argument.
Right.
It's like hitting a brick wall, and then they get more and more frustrated.
Sure. That's exactly what I was trying to say.
Yeah.
The more, when you're in a discussion with, I'll use a discussion. If you're in a discussion with somebody and that person's being very logical and that other person is very emotional, the emotions just keep running higher.
Right.
Because that person gets more belligerent and the other person gets even more, like, can now refute the arguments even easier, because now as the argument goes on, that person that's emotional, the arguments are less concrete. Now it's just solely emotion.
Right.
Very little facts. So it almost like builds upon itself as that discussion goes on. And you can see like now people that have conversations like a certain age group that haven't been taught that in school or haven't been able to critical think or haven't been able to have those kind of arguments. It's just solely emotional. And that's in everything. That's in everything, work and everything and anything.
And
so
and it's one of those things that'll just, it won't end until we learn, okay, we're going to have to train our children.
Sure.
Not only how to think,
Right.
but why you should train how to think.
Right.
So if you give them that fire, then they can turn train their children. And then that's the only way to correct this.
Right.
I think we're seeing that. We're seeing many things from the past several years. We're seeing the fruits of removing some things from how we train our children and how we school our children.
Mm-hmm.
We're seeing a lot of that, the downstream effects and the fruits of that. And I think what we're learning is, okay, well, we need to make some corrections.
Sure.
And so there's probably a cry for more information about that. And that's what this podcast episode was about is, hey, there's a lot of stuff to think about and consider. Maybe when I do have a discussion with my aunt Peru or whoever, and I get frustrated by what she says, maybe I should understand exactly like how to form a coherent argument.
Right.
And then study that, and then my mind might be changed as a result of that. But in general, you're not going to change someone's mind through an argument like that.
Yeah.
That comes from just reasoned study and willing to accept that, hey, okay, you did point out that this is fallacious thinking, so maybe I should reconsider.
I think part of it, I won't go on too much of a diatribe. I think part of it is that people don't like to lose now. Because things are like, you just, when this is probably outplayed, but like everybody gets a trophy kind of situation, that people get used to not losing. So and that's in everything, like an argument. So to be logical, I think you also have to be somebody that can admit, maybe not, you don't have to love it, but you can obviously know that you've been wrong about something or you were incorrect. If somebody can poke holes in your logic, but now I think that's part of the reason why emotion gets brought into it, is because people are so, that's part of growing up.
Yeah.
Is it's less emotional, and like you can separate your job and things that go on at work, and you can be logical, and I can be right or I can be wrong, and I have to like suck it up both ways, and you just can't be right all the time.
Right.
It just is what it is. But if you get super upset when you're wrong, that so much that you won't let it go, or that you can't just be like, okay, yes, I was wrong. We have to move on. I think that makes it even worse now. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. Across? Yeah. And you brought up the everybody gets a trophy thing. It boils down to just that's an emotional thing, rather than just understand that, Johnny was better at me than this, and that's why he got the trophy. He won the spelling bee, or he won the 100-meter race, whatever it is, fill in the blank, and just accept that. And if I want to get better than Johnny, then I'm going to have to train my body or my mind or both to get better than Johnny.
I also truly believe that if you muddy that water, like everybody gets a trophy kind of situation, or everybody's right, or, like winning feels so good only when you know how bad losing feels.
Right.
Then winning feels so good. So that's like something that but that kind of stuff is what drives innovation in general.
It does. Absolutely.
So like when somebody's, down in the dirt and kicked and they triumph, they keep working, they keep innovating because they know how bad it felt to be down there and how good it feels to be up here. And that's with a bunch of things. I'll just use a perfect example. Mabry, I had some injuries. I took some time off of CrossFit.
Right.
I used to beat Mabry all the time. Mabry's on the Reaching for the Bars podcast. If you're a listener, he's on our other podcast. I come back and I'm like, well, I'll just pick up right where I left off and keep beating Mabry. And Mabry's gotten very good.
Yeah.
So like that, I almost forgot what it felt like to lose like that. So now I'm like super motivated.
Right.
But I know like if everybody was just like, we won't put any scores in and nobody knows who wins or anything, it doesn't feel as good. And you don't work as hard.
Right.
So that's, part of that whole thing. Like it's way easier to be a logical thinker if you can accept, when you get in a conversation with somebody, that it's not necessarily, you don't have to be right. You can be logical. And if somebody, you could be incorrect, you just learn why you're wrong, do more research, whatever you were talking about. But I think that drives you to do more research, to learn more, to, do whatever you probably,
increase your understanding.
Yeah. Increase your understanding.
Yeah.
So,
I had a couple more fallacies I want to run down, but I could lump those into a future podcast. I wanted to do one on biases.
Okay.
And so I'm going to save some of those for the biases episode. I think that might be beneficial. So just to conclude this,
sure.
What'd you get out of this? What's your takeaways, Dustin?
Okay. So when I was thinking about logic, I kind of had, when you told me about this topic, I had one thought on it. Like just like logic in terms of possibly like problem solving. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like this one. So that's kind of what I was expecting when I walked in here. But for you to say like the first thing that you said, that some people don't assign to this, that logic is this, that it's there aren't truths. That kind of blew my mind right off the bat because I never really put too much thought to that specific thing. And then when you were talking about these fallacies, and you could kind of be like, these are the fallacies. And when you put them into an example, I mean, that's what happens. When you argue with somebody, these are actual things that you have an argument about with people. Like they attack you versus attacking your argument. Somebody will say, just trust me. I know what I'm talking about.
I'm a doctor.
I'm a doctor or whatever. You trust me. I know what I'm talking about.
I'm the coach.
So for you to to tie that in, because I don't think necessarily I would have thought of it in that avenue when we were talking about logic, being like, well, if you want to solve a Rubik's Cube, you have to do this kind of thing.
Yeah.
But this is very interesting because when that happens often, everyday life.
It is.
That happens in everyday life. All those things that we just talked about, those fallacies that we just talked about, those are all things that we encounter every single day.
Every single day. You see it at work. You see it around the house. You see it with friends. It's just there's human interaction.
Yep.
And unless you've been trained to discipline your mind,
yeah,
you will do that yourself. I do it myself.
I think everybody that probably does it. Yeah.
Yeah, everyone does it. And in fact, if you go to, let's say, the top logician, the most logical person in the United States or the world,
logician,
I bet you they probably, when they're having an argument with their wife, they probably whip out an old
you never load the dishwasher.
So's your old man, and stuff like that, and like you lose your temper, you lose your thing.
Just to tie that in, you're just like your old man. Did you ever listen to Dane Cook?
I have heard of him.
He does this joke, which is exactly what you're saying. And he's having this argument with his girl, and he says women are really difficult to argue with, and they're like ninjas. So his girlfriend would be like, they'd be arguing about something totally different, and then she'd be like, "You're stupid, just like your old man." And he said, at first that doesn't bother you. He's like, but then you're walking around downstairs and you're like talking to yourself, and you're like, "My father was a great man."
That's funny.
Yeah. So, but yeah, I think you're right. I think everybody, no matter how logical you are, you get into an emotional situation where you may be like, "You never fill the car up with gas."
Right.
You know what I mean?
So there is a truth. That's what I subscribe to.
Yep.
And I think you can argue that there is a transcendent truth, that those laws of logic, they are foundational, and they seem like overly simplified.
Sure.
But they're these primary laws that the foundation is built on that.
Mm-hmm.
We learned about that there's a whole field of study on syllogisms. So I encourage our listeners, look that up.
Do it.
And the fun thing is to look up logical or informal logic fallacies.
Okay.
Those are kind of funny because you read through those, you're like, yeah, I've done that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do that all the time. I just did that 2 minutes ago.
Yep.
So anyway, hopefully you all enjoyed this. We would enjoy your feedback. We crave that feedback from you to see how things are going. We're already starting to get some comments on the YouTube channel.
Yep.
So I'm excited about that.
And we also got our first couple suggestions on topics, which we will get into those.
Okay.
Yep. I told you about those.
That's right.
Yep.
Yeah.
So I won't say who it was, but when we do the episode, I'll say who gave us the ideas.
Yeah. There we go.
That'll be good.
So that concludes the episode. I hope you enjoyed it, and we will see you next week.
Next week.
Yeah.
Goodbye.
Bye.